Hello, everyone, and welcome to Day 2 of the Global Water Futures Annual Open Science Meeting. As you are aware, this meeting is entirely virtual this year. We hope that you were able to join us yesterday and take advantage of the rich presentations and discussions that occurred. If not, the programming can be accessed online. I'm Corinne Schuster-Wallace. I'm Associate Director of Global Water Futures, and I'm joining you today from Saskatoon, situated on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. We spend our time living, learning, and interacting in many traditional territories and homelands across Canada and around the world. I wish us safe, productive, and respectful encounters in these places and invite you to reflect upon your relationships with the land and the First Peoples. Depending on which parallel sessions and posters that you engaged in yesterday, you'll have heard about and discussed water-related topics ranging from models, sensors and processes, to vulnerable ecosystems and regions, Indigenous community research, and next-gen solutions for infectious disease surveillance. The models, tools, and knowledge generated through Indigenous and Western knowledge systems within Global Water Futures will help to support decision-making in these unprecedented times of change. We've seen the struggles that communities have had dealing with floods or lack of running water during a pandemic. Now, many people are speaking to the drought conditions that are being observed in different parts of Canada this spring. We've also seen that water-related impacts are not borne equally by everyone, depending on the intersecting identities that we hold, such as age, race, socioeconomic status, gender identity, and ability. As you heard from Dr. Pomeroy in his opening presentation yesterday, one of the recent advances in Global Water Futures has been the articulation of a strategy for equity, diversity, and inclusion that cuts across not only how we work together as colleagues in our institutions, but also how we conduct our research and mobilize our knowledge. For more information, or to sign up for our first training session on interrupting bias next week, check out our GWF EDI webpage. We have another exciting program lined up for today. You can visit GWF2021.com for all of the details. To start off today's sessions, we have two great plenary speakers, Chelsea Lobson and Danika Littlechild. Before I formally introduce them, there are a few housekeeping items to go over. There's a Q&A box on your screen. Please enter your questions there. And don't forget to vote on your favorite questions and see in real time which questions are most popular. Closed captioning is also available. You can click on the CC button to access this feature. The sessions are being recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards. And finally, don't forget to engage with us on social media using the hashtag GWF2021. I also want to encourage participants to check out GWF's annual science meeting code of conduct on the ASM webpage. GWF's code of conduct is designed to promote vigorous scientific debate grounded in respect for one another. And now, it's my great pleasure to invite our first keynote speaker, Ms. Chelsea Lobson, to join us. Chelsea is Program Director for the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. In this position, Chelsea oversees the Lake Winnipeg Foundation's program development with specific responsibility for the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network. Chelsea's talk today focuses on completing the Data to Impact Cycle, the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network. This is a topic of particular relevance to Global Water Futures and to sustainable water solutions, as we can't manage what we don't know. Data are an essential part of the Government of Canada's commitment to evidence-informed decision-making and an activity pillar in the Global Water Futures program. I, for one, look forward to learning more about how this is being accomplished under the Lake Winnipeg Foundation's program. Chelsea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me today, and to everyone for being here. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network, which is a long-term phosphorus monitoring program designed to identify phosphorus hotspots in the watershed. And I'll also be sharing how all of this work feeds into what we call the data to impact cycle. Before I begin, I want to recognize that Lake Winnipeg, the lake that we at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation are working to protect, is a part of the traditional territories of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Métis. And this is a lake that has long been cared for by the people living on its shores. So to begin, the Lake Winnipeg Foundation was founded in 2005 by a group of concerned lake lovers who believed that citizens had a role to play in improving the health of Lake Winnipeg. Now, just over 15 years later, combining the expertise of our Science Advisory Council and the commitment of our members, the Lake Winnipeg Foundation is nationally recognized for our unique capacity to link science and action. Our goal is to ensure that policy and practices informed by evidence are implemented and enforced to protect Lake Winnipeg. And one of the greatest challenges facing Lake Winnipeg is eutrophication. And we know from decades of whole ecosystem science at the experimental lakes area that phosphorus is what drives eutrophication in freshwater lakes like Lake Winnipeg. And here you can see what might be the single most powerful image in the history of limnology, something that I remember seeing a lot in various textbooks throughout university. This was the experiment where the double basin lake was divided in half with a curtain. On this side of the lake, carbon and nitrogen were added. On this side of the lake, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus were added. And of course, it was the side with phosphorus that saw or that developed algae blooms. Since this experiment, the experimental lakes area has continued to add phosphorus in lakes, at the beginning with nitrogen as well, and slowly decreasing the nitrogen. And even with nitrogen reduced to zero, algae blooms continue to occur. And so we know from this research that we really need to focus on phosphorus if we want to address these algae blooms occurring on Lake Winnipeg. So with that evidence as our foundation, the Lake Winnipeg Foundation developed the Lake Winnipeg Health Plan, which is an 8-action health plan, with each action addressing one of the root causes of phosphorus loading to Lake Winnipeg. So for example, under Action 3 of the health plan, setting the standard for wastewater treatment, here the Lake Winnipeg Foundation advocates for upgrades to wastewater treatment systems to include phosphorus reduction. Lately, our work here is focused on advocacy for the upgrades to the North End treatment plant in Winnipeg, which is the single largest point source of phosphorus. Under Action 6 of the health plan, promoting agricultural water stewardship, here we evaluate phosphorus beneficial management practices in the landscape for their phosphorus reduction impact and ensure that they're effective at reducing phosphorus like we hope they are. In Action 1, keeping water on the land, here we advocate for restoring and protecting natural wetlands, which as we know are like the kidneys of the watershed, filtering out the nutrients before they enter Lake Winnipeg. And under Action 4 of the health plan, monitoring our waterways, this is where we coordinate the Lake Winnipeg community-based monitoring network. And the reason that monitoring is an action to reduce phosphorus loading to the lake is because in order to reduce that phosphorus, we first need to know where it's coming from. So here's a map of the Lake Winnipeg watershed. As I'm sure most of you know, the watershed is huge, spanning from just west of Calgary to just west of Thunder Bay, dipping into 4 American states. And when we look at the map of this watershed, the challenges facing Lake Winnipeg can seem insurmountable, especially as a Manitoban who gets to enjoy Lake Winnipeg frequently. Worrying about what's happening in another province or in the US can make the challenge seem overwhelming. And And the good news is, though, that not all areas of the watershed contribute the same amount of phosphorus. And so if we can identify the areas that contribute more phosphorus on average, which we call phosphorus hotspots, we can then target resources and remedial action to these hotspots to have an impact on Lake Winnipeg. Here is another map of the watershed broken down into the major tributaries to Lake Winnipeg. So for example, this is the Red River and the Assiniboine. This is the Winnipeg River system and the Saskatchewan River. And this is about the level of data resolution that's shared in the State of Lake Winnipeg report, which is released by the provincial and federal governments. And this data does a good job of telling us the high level sources of phosphorus to Lake Winnipeg. So for example, from this data, we know that the Red River, together with the Assiniboine, contributes about 68% of the total phosphorus load to Lake Winnipeg. So it's definitely an area that we want to focus our efforts if we want to address the algae blooms and phosphorus loading. But this is still a really large area. And so there's lots of different land use types, lots of varying topography. And so ideally, we would be able to break this down further to more accurately pinpoint phosphorus hotspots within these larger watersheds. And that's exactly what the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network does. It was designed to complement provincially and federally collected data by sampling at many of the smaller tributaries within those larger drainage areas so that we can break them down into smaller pieces and more accurately identify hotspots to target resources where action is required to improve the health of Lake Winnipeg. And everyone is putting so much effort into collecting this data, from our volunteers to our watershed partners and science advisors. It's important that the effort is useful in realizing actual phosphorus reduction from the watershed. So the Lake Winnipeg Foundation developed the data to impact cycle. And by focusing on completing this cycle, we are ensuring that data which gets collected also gets used to answer the questions that in many cases prompted data collection in the first place. So at the top of this data to impact cycle, we have the first action I'm going to talk about, which is the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network methods are designed to enable frequent and responsive phosphorus monitoring. And this is all about how the community-based monitoring model is used to fill a specific data gap. So in 2017, researchers from Environment and Climate Change Canada released a paper where they studied 11 sub-watersheds on the western side of the Red River Valley. So for those who are familiar, this is Winnipeg, the Red River, this is the Canada-US border, and here are the drainage areas that were monitored by the researchers. It's a relatively small area, with these drainage areas being really right next to one another. And the researchers conducted frequent sampling during the spring melt period. This is when phosphorus runs off the land and into our waterways with snow melt. And then responsive sampling to rain events throughout the remainder of the season, other times when phosphorus runs off the land and into our waters with heavy rainfall. And the researchers found that by doing this frequent and responsive sampling, they were able to identify phosphorus hotspots in these drainage areas, which are very similar to one another, in some cases right next to one another, and one might be a hotspot and one might not be. And we recognize at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation that this was really the level of data resolution that we needed to be making more informed evidence-based decisions for Lake Winnipeg. But of course, this is a research project. It was in a specific area over a determined amount of time, and this wasn't meant to become a large-scale government monitoring program. And that would just be a crazy amount of resources to collect that type of data from a centralized organization. But the Lake Winnipeg Foundation recognized the potential to mobilize citizen scientists who live, work, or commute near their sampling site and can collect those frequent samples during the spring melt and collect samples responsively to rain events throughout the season and allow us to generate that frequent and responsive phosphorus data from many sites within the watershed that will allow us to identify these hotspots. And so that's exactly what we've done. And here you can see a sampling schedule for one of our sites, Rose Isle Creek. This is located in southwestern Manitoba. So the blue line on this chart is water flow, and the black dots are phosphorus concentration. So as you can see, during this first peak here, this is the spring melt period when the snow is melting and bringing with it all of the phosphorus. And as you can see, there's high flow and high concentration. And so this has a high potential for phosphorus loading. And then later in the season, there's this rain event here, another small peak, which also resulted in a peak in phosphorus concentration. And as you can see, if this was a traditional monitoring program, which was sampling every few months or quarterly based on a calendar, these peaks and these phosphorus concentration peaks could likely be missed, and we could be drastically underestimating the phosphorus load occurring from these sites. So having the volunteers at the sites allows us to accurately estimate the phosphorus load from these tributaries. And as you might have gathered from the previous slide, water flow is also really important to us. So we sample at Water Survey of Canada stations whenever possible. We also partner with Manitoba Hydro and Ontario Power Generation, who have flow data in the Winnipeg River system. But this flow data is great for two reasons. One of them is that it allows us to monitor the flow online in real time. And this allows us to mobilize the citizen scientists when a flow event is occurring and we need them to go collect a sample. But it also allows us to calculate the phosphorus load from a site. So the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network phosphorus data is multiplied by the Water Survey of Canada's flow data to calculate the phosphorus load, which is the actual amount of phosphorus running by a sample site in tons per year. And then the other piece of data that is incorporated into our program is the drainage area. And this allows us to calculate the phosphorus export, which is the amount of phosphorus in kilograms per hectare per year being contributed by a drainage area, and allows us to compare sites that might have different drainage areas and therefore compare the relative phosphorus contribution. And this drainage area data comes from the Water Survey of Canada, as well as from watershed delineations from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And once we have these phosphorus exports and we've combined the data sources to calculate them, this is how we identify the phosphorus hotspots in the watershed. And that's the next step in the data to impact cycle. So we've mobilized the volunteers to collect the frequent and responsive data needed to calculate phosphorus exports in combination with the Water Survey and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada additional data. And then we are able to identify phosphorus hotspots in the watershed. And so here's a map of our phosphorus export data from 2019. As you can see, we have pretty good spread of the program across southern Manitoba and now increasing in northwestern Ontario. And the sites that are more red have higher phosphorus exports, and the sites that are green have lower and even potentially negative phosphorus exports, which means they are sequestering phosphorus. And a lot of these sites, especially in the southeastern portion of the province, are sites that we have identified as hotspots consistently since we began sampling in 2016. And so we can say with relative confidence that these are hotspots that need to be addressed in order to have an impact on Lake Winnipeg. Some other sites, like this hotspot in the lower Winnipeg River system, this was our first year of collecting data from that site. And it was also a relatively different year with a lot of fall flooding in that region. And so we would really want to have multiple years of data to fully understand what's happening there before making any recommendations about targeting resources and remedial action to those sites. Here is a map of our 2018 phosphorus export data. And as you can see, it looks very different from 2019. The program did grow in between those 2 years, but also, of course, you can see there was low phosphorus loading and exports from all of the drainage areas that were sampled. And that's because 2018 was a relatively dry year in the watershed. There was limited snowmelt and not a lot of rain events or anything that would increase phosphorus loading throughout the year. And while this data didn't help us identify phosphorus hotspots, it did allow us to talk about the importance of water flow in driving phosphorus loading to Lake Winnipeg, and point to potential solutions like permanent water storage solutions and the importance of protecting wetlands in order to hold water on the land and kind of mimic these drier, low loading years in wetter years where we would normally see hotspots pop up. The 2018 data also highlights the importance of long-term monitoring programs for accounting for interannual variation. Of course, if this was the only year that we collected data on phosphorus loading from the watershed, we would have a very skewed vision of kind of what's happening in terms of phosphorus loading towards Lake Winnipeg. And so we've collected the frequent and responsive data that allows us to identify hotspots, and now resources and remedial action can be targeted to phosphorus hotspots for guaranteed impact. And the first step of ensuring that our data is available for those wanting to target their resources is that it needs to be available online in an open and accessible way. And for the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network, we use DataStream to share our data. One of the great benefits of this platform is that the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network phosphorus data is being held and is you're able to see it on the same map as the phosphorus data collected by Environment and Climate Change Canada or the province of Manitoba. And our program was designed to collect complementary data. So having all of these data sources in the same place is really valuable to us and potential data users. And we've also heard from both our volunteer citizen scientists who like to zoom in on the map and see what's going on at their site, as well as researchers and modelers who are looking to just download our raw data. It seems to work for everyone at all different levels. But another really important part of our program is that we don't only share the raw data online, we also analyze and interpret the data and ensure it's being shared in an accessible way. So to do this, we release regional and network level reports after each field season. And the regional reports are based off of watershed districts, which in Manitoba, watershed districts are the groups that do the on-the-ground kind of beneficial management practice building, lots of retention projects and water management. And so we really want this data to be available and accessible to those groups so that they can use this to inform their project planning. So the data is analyzed and interpreted, put into regional hotspot maps, put into graphs and explained in understandable ways. And we also share the data as much as possible through community presentations and ensure that we're making clear recommendations to the watershed districts on how they can use this data. So again, if they get funding from the provincial government for a water retention project, they can use our data to kind of target that project to a hotspot. But also they can use our data to use as rationale kind of in those funding applications. So saying like this project is happening in a hotspot and you'll have better return on investment if you fund this water project that we're working on. And so really making it clear how this data can be used and be beneficial to the watershed districts and other partners. We've also been using the data to inform other actions of the Lake Winnipeg Health Plan. So for example, under Action 3, setting the standard for wastewater treatment, when we were doing a lot of the advocacy for the North End treatment plant in Winnipeg, which is the single largest point source of phosphorus, we were presenting that this was the City of Winnipeg sewage contributes 5% of the total phosphorus load to Lake Winnipeg, which we thought was a lot. But a lot of the questions that we've received in return were, okay, 5%, but what about the other 95%? Shouldn't we be focusing on that? And the Lake Winnipeg Foundation used Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network data to kind of debunk that myth of the other 95% by showing that the other sources are diffuse sources from drainage areas that contribute 1% or 2%, potentially even 0.25%, and there is really no other 95%. And 5% of the phosphorus load coming from one pipe is like the ultimate phosphorus hotspot that needs to be identified. So using this to kind of make the case for wastewater improvements in Winnipeg. We're also really excited about how researchers are using our data to inform their work. So for example, we are partnering with Dr. Kumara Gamaje from the University of Winnipeg, who is studying soil amendments that can potentially bind phosphorus in soil and reduce phosphorus runoff during the spring melt from flooded soils. And Dr. Kumara Gamaje is using this data, using the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network data to target her field studies to phosphorus hotspots where these the outcomes of her research might be the most useful and have the greatest impact if they are successful. So that's really great to see academics using this data to inform their work. Of course, our partners at IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, use the data in a report that they wrote called Geography Matters: Landscape Targeting for Improved Environmental Outcomes, where they combine the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network data with agriculture census data to identify trends in beneficial management practices in the watershed. Another really interesting way that our data is being used that we were not expecting until we began releasing the data and saw a lot of excitement from this area is in watershed modeling. So I guess, as we know, the outcomes of watershed models are only as accurate as the data that's being put into those models. And so having this frequent and responsive and accurate phosphorus loading data feed into these models we've seen a lot of uptake from the people doing that as the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network can be used as an input to those models. But we've also seen that a lot of the models are looking at the watershed, trying to identify hotspots for beneficial management practice targeting as well. And in many cases, the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network data is actually used to ground truth the outputs of these models. And so it's pretty cool when citizen-generated data is being used by a federal monitoring or a federal modeling effort to, or as the truth or the ground truth in that project. And of course, the program was designed to identify hotspots so that funders like Environment and Climate Change Canada's Lake Winnipeg Basin Program, the provincial government in Manitoba, or the Manitoba Habitat and Heritage Corporation, which is another funder of on-the-ground projects, can use this data to target their funding to the hotspots. And while the data is not fully integrated into this process yet, we continue to do presentations to these groups and kind of make recommendations on how they can use the data so that it is available to them once they are interested. And so the data is collected, hotspots identified, remedial action targeted. But now we need to make sure that the work that's being targeted into the hotspots is actually being effective at reducing phosphorus. And so this part of the cycle is measurable phosphorus reduction is achieved in phosphorus hotspots, and it's all about evaluation of the work that's being done. So under this part of the cycle, the Lake Winnipeg Foundation coordinates the Agricultural Water Stewardship Program, which is a new program that we launched in 2019. And the goal of this program is to monitor beneficial management practices, specifically designed for phosphorus reduction, to measure their phosphorus reduction impact and see how effective they actually are at reducing phosphorus in the targeted hotspots. And so this is Julie out. She has to do a lot of work during the spring melt to ensure she gets that, that high resolution data from these sites. And I think anyone who's done this type of work knows that it takes a lot of work to collect that daily flow and concentration data during the spring melt period and in response to any rain events, to ensure that we're actually calculating the load in and the load out of the system and know how effective they are at sequestering phosphorus in the watershed. And so once we know what's affected or the things that aren't effective are being adapted to improve their efficacy, we need the long-term monitoring data and to continue to collect that baseline data to evaluate the collective impact across the larger watershed. And so this action is just all about continuing to collect data to understand how phosphorus is being reduced and ensure that it is being reduced. If it isn't, things of course need to be adapted. So for this, we just need to continue to collect that baseline data. And we want to continue to expand into other areas, continue to grow the program so that we can continue this cycle in other regions and ensure that we're being effective at reducing phosphorus. Another part of ensuring that this long-term program is continuing to collect baseline data is engaging more and more citizen scientists. So while we do have many sites sampled by citizen scientists, we also have a lot of sites that are sampled by partners like watershed district partners. And ideally, as many sites as possible would be taken on by citizen scientists just to ensure that the sampling isn't based on funding for travel or the busyness of field season during the spring, but that this data is continued to be collected by the citizens over the long term. And of course, this whole cycle kind of collapses if we don't have that frequent and responsive data. And so ensuring that volunteers are getting a lot out of the program, ensuring that they are engaged and see the value in participating, as it can be a lot of work collecting samples frequently during the spring melt, and of course being kind of on call during the rest of the field season if a rain event occurs. So we have an annual gathering each year where we invite all the volunteers, our science advisors, our watershed partners. Here we present all of the data from the previous year. We release our reports. And we also have presentations from other partners who are potentially using the data, and they can show kind of the value of this data that they're collecting, as well as people who might be doing work complementary to the network. This year, we're also piloting a sampling sites newsletter, which is directed towards volunteers. Since sampling is kind of a solitary activity for a lot of people, we wanted to remind them that they're a part of this collective effort to collect phosphorus data across the watershed. So we share stories from the field, have things like photo contests, share background science information, and all sorts of things like that. And each year we do field audits with volunteers. So we meet them at the site, ensure they're following the protocols correctly, bring check samples and blank samples. But the biggest benefit of these field audits is meeting the volunteer at the site, having that face-to-face interaction, and getting feedback from them on the program, finding out what they need to ensure that things are as easy as possible for them. So we've heard feedback like a laminated kind of cheat sheet on the protocol, a YouTube video that they can use to refresh their the protocol before they go out in the spring. So we get lots of useful information from the field audits that will ensure that the data is being collected properly, and we just continue to kind of refine our protocols. So that's the data to impact cycle. And one of the great things about the program that's starting to occur now is that not only is the phosphorus reduction potential and the infrastructure that we've built to collect that phosphorus data isn't only being recognized, but the kind of systems and infrastructure that we've built to potentially collect other parameters is also being valued and recognized by different groups. So for example, in 2020, we began a pilot project with the University of Manitoba. A grad student, Braden, from the stress ecology lab there, added a salinity a vial to each of our sample packs that he will then get a water sample from and be able to measure salinity. And so because we have these groups on the ground ready to sample, and it's easy to kind of add that extra vial, this research study will now have a full kind of landscape scan of salinity concentrations and hotspots and whatnot in the watershed. So it's really great that the network that we've built is being recognized in that way. And the value of having that nimble and responsive network of citizen scientists ready to collect a sample was also highlighted in 2019 when we had a really wet, unprecedentedly wet fall. There were a lot of storms that resulted in fall flooding in lots of parts of the province. And the first time I think the floodway had to be opened around Winnipeg in the fall. And what we saw here is that having the volunteers kind of on the ground, able to collect those samples was really beneficial. And these are the types of weather patterns that are becoming more expected, and these less predictable weather patterns might be happening more as we look into the future with a changing climate. And so having the volunteers on the ground able to monitor those unprecedented or unpredictable weather patterns that we might see more of is a huge value as well. And of course, the value of having the folks on the ground near their sampling site was highlighted in 2020 when the pandemic came to Manitoba at the same time as the spring melt was just about to begin. But we heard from a lot of volunteers that they were kind of cooped up at home and could see, maybe potentially even see the river kind of from their house. They really wanted to be going out sampling, and it is a solitary activity or occurs kind of within households, and the sampling sites are generally very close to where people live, and so they don't need to be traveling far or putting themselves at risk that way. And so we were able to adapt our protocol with support from our science advisors and ensure that data could be collected in 2020 in a safe way. And so with that, I just want to share with you a report that the Lake Winnipeg Foundation will be releasing in the next few weeks. And this is the report that the data to impact cycle was generated for. It's called Realizing the Full Potential of Community-Based Monitoring. And it's all about the integration of community-based monitoring network data into Environment and Climate Change Canada's regional water programs, and specifically the Lake Winnipeg Basin program for our work. And so if you work with any of these regional programs, I think this information would apply to many different groups. And so I definitely recommend giving it a read if you are interested. And with that, thank you so much for your attention this morning. I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you ever so much, Chelsea. And thank you and congratulations to every single one of your volunteer citizen scientists. If ever we needed a reminder of the power and potential of an individual, and how collectively we can come together to affect change. You've just given it to us. So thank you ever so much. And so many ways that it's relevant to our program here at Global Water Futures, from sort of adverse water quality, hotspot identification, to the interventions and community engagement. And I'll open up to questions now. Before I do, I'll just remind people it's not too late to add your questions in the Q&A box, and you can also vote for the questions that you would like to see answered. And so with that, I know there are several questions already there and voted on. So Stephanie, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. It's nice to see so much engagement in the Q&A box. We have a lot of questions that came in for Chelsea. A lot of interest in both the engagement side of the programming and the technical aspects as well. So I think I will kind of combine a few questions and ask you to maybe go into a little bit more detail around the engagement process with the community-based scientists that are involved in the program. Maybe a bit more about, you know, how many individuals are engaged. Do you provide any incentives for them to contribute to the program? Specifically, do you engage and how can Indigenous communities become more engaged in the governance and data collection in the watershed? Things like that. That's of a lot of interest to folks watching.
Great. Okay, so I guess to begin, we have not had to provide a lot of incentives to people. We've done quite a few surveys asking, like, what do you want? Do you want like a trophy or a certificate? And I think people are just really excited to have a tangible, kind of hands-on way to get involved in caring for the water that's often really important to them, as it's kind of close to where they live. In terms of kind of reaching out to volunteers and how we recruit them, it's done primarily organically. So we might have like a blog post about it on our website, and people will email with interest. But in lots of the communities where we don't have, like the Lake Winnipeg Foundation doesn't have a lot of membership, we work really closely with the watershed districts. They have strong ties to the people in their area. They might know who lives kind of right by the Water Survey of Canada station and would be interested in participating. And so we rely heavily on them for making those connections between us and the volunteers. We also partner with organizations like the Manitoba Métis Federation, who's the Métis government in Manitoba, and they have citizens all across Manitoba. So that partnership has been really valuable to us, as they can kind of identify people who might be interested in volunteering as a part of as a citizen scientist in the program, and who might be in a region that we're looking to kind of fill and find new volunteers for. So that Manitoba Métis Federation partnership has been really great. We also have begun a lot of conversations with First Nations guardians programs who might be interested in adding a phosphorus component to their larger monitoring program, which is exciting. But we haven't actually began any of that at this point. I hope that answers most of those questions.
Thank you. Stephanie, you said you had some questions about phosphorus as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions related to kind of understanding land-based inputs. You know, how do you do that? And I'm trying to find the one that I was particularly interested in. For sites sequestering phosphorus, how do you determine the phosphorus inputs to the land?
Okay, so for those sites that might have a negative phosphorus export, those are identified because we might have many sites along one waterway. So for example, like the Pembina River watershed, there's many tributaries that go into that river, and we have many sites kind of along the Pembina River. And the way that we calculate the load is in that incremental way is by subtracting the load at the upstream site from the load at the downstream site to know kind of what's being contributed on that leg of the river. And if that number is negative, then it means that kind of that area is sequestering phosphorus rather than contributing phosphorus. A lot of those types of sites are sites that actually have lakes in them, where the phosphorus is kind of being precipitated out into the sediments of the lake oftentimes, and sometimes those lakes, it's actually an area that's green on the map sequestering phosphorus, but that lake might be having algae bloom challenges as well. So that question about the negative phosphorus export sites is really interesting thing to look at.
And what about timing? So timing of phosphorus delivery is a very important factor in controlling algal growth. Is this being looked at in Lake Winnipeg?
I would say not by our program necessarily. Our goal is to kind of collect that baseline data and make sure it's available to the people who might use it to answer some of those more research-based questions. So our program does point towards the spring melt, usually being the most important time for phosphorus loading in the watershed. That's when most of the phosphorus, often over 90% of the phosphorus, is running off the land and into our waterways. So that's a really important time in the watershed to be addressing the phosphorus loading. I think there have been remote sensing studies on algae blooms on Lake Winnipeg that identified that the spring phosphorus load to the lake is also one of the #1 predictors, along with summer temperatures, in predicting how severe algae blooms will be in a year. So I think, yeah, we're interested in timing work in that way, but we don't do any of that research necessarily ourselves.
One question about kind of understanding drainage, wetland drainage from the prairies into Lake Winnipeg. Do you have a sense of the contribution coming from there?
No, no. And again, our program kind of identifies where the phosphorus is coming from, but not what is causing that phosphorus loading. So we can make correlations between different land use types and things like that in the areas, but ideally that's where kind of we would partner with academic researchers who could kind of take that hotspot and drill down and do those studies to identify exactly like the source, whether it's agriculture, livestock, or wastewater, the source of that phosphorus, or wetland drainage, I guess.
Maybe a couple more questions related to the engagement of citizen scientists. So citizen scientists collect a lot of data. Who does the analysis of that?
Yeah, good question. So the volunteers collect the sample and we analyze it. So previously, we've analyzed our samples at the University of Manitoba in the Center for Earth Observation Science, and we've done that ourselves as LWF staff. But with the pandemic, we were having trouble kind of accessing the lab, of course, and also we're very safe at LWF, so we didn't want to be putting people at risk or anything. So we kind of use it as an opportunity to rethink like how we're doing lab analysis, and if this is really what we want to be doing kind of with our time. So we're really excited this year that we're going to be beginning a new partnership with the University of Winnipeg, where a graduate student will actually be provided a stipend to analyze our samples for us. So we're really excited to kind of have that off our plate so that we can focus more on the engagement and the connections to policy and that kind of thing, and just have the analyzed samples kind of come to us, which will be really great.
And can you speak to any of the challenges associated with citizen science, and maybe some of the ways that you try and reduce, the errors or the standardization of data collection, and some of some of those challenges that can arise?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we work really hard on. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is just convincing people that community-based monitoring network data is a valuable source of data that can be used and trusted. And we're really lucky to have science advisors at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation who help us with this. And and help us kind of prove the safety kind of, I guess, of our data. So one of the ways that we do this is by doing those field audits. So we meet the volunteers. Well, I guess first, honestly, doing intensive kind of training. So meeting the volunteer at the site, showing them how to go through it, why we do each step. We have a really detailed protocol that kind of goes through everything and why we do it, to ensure that they kind of have everything that they need to collect a proper water sample. And then we meet them in the field throughout the season to do a field audit. And we weren't able to do these last year because of COVID, but we're hoping that this summer we are able to meet volunteers in the field. And we watch them collect a sample and make notes and ensure that they're following the protocol correctly. We also bring a blank sample with us. So there is some equipment that is used over and over again. So for example, the sampling device, it is rinsed 2 times before collecting the actual sample, but it's used over and over again. So just a better understanding of kind of what's being transferred between each sample. So we bring a blank sample for them to process, and then also a check sample. So one of the things that our science advisors were concerned about was that a lot of the sites that are being sampled have high particulate phosphorus and a lot of sediment in the water, and the risk of having all these different people collecting the sample would be in the variation in the way that people shake the bottle before processing the sample. And so we take a sample of Red River water, which is really high in particulate phosphorus, and kind of mix that all up, subdivide it, and bring that out to the audits to see and measure the variation kind of in that particulate phosphorus concentration. And we've actually seen surprisingly low variation in those results, which is great. And then I think, again, just getting the feedback from the volunteers on what they need to ensure they're following the protocols correctly, like the that kind of cheat sheet for in the field for going through the protocol quickly, and then also that YouTube video, those types of things I think have a really big impact on ensuring the quality of our data. And we've also started using an in the field app for metadata collection. So that limits that, which is probably more on our end than the volunteers, but taking that field sheet on paper and transcribing it so many times over, where there's the potential for error expanding kind of each time it's transcribed. So having that field app feed right into the database, and then it can be checked kind of one time, gives us a lot of peace of mind as well that we're not messing up any of the information that they provided.
Great. I think that was really important to touch on for the audience of scientists that we have attending this conference. So thanks for those details. Maybe I'll just ask one more quick question, and then Corinne, if you had a final thought or question for Chelsea. Someone has said that this all sounds very expensive. Could you comment on how your program is funded?
Yeah, sure. So we have program funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada's Lake Winnipeg Basin program, and we also receive funding from various other foundations. The Lake Winnipeg Foundation is a charity, so for example, we just got funding from CN Community Foundation, or we receive funding from TD, Friends of the Environment, which is great. But the program really kind of runs itself, and it is affordable in the way that the volunteers live near their site, so there isn't a lot of travel involved other than the time of year when we go audit them. Doing the lab analysis ourselves, or even with having a graduate student do it, saves us a lot of money relative to going to an ALS lab or paying that $70 for the analysis. So it really is a efficient process towards collecting this type of data. And there's actually, I'll give a little plug for the IISD ELA are working on a kind of economic case study for community-based monitoring right now, and showing how efficient these programs are at collecting monitoring data. And the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network is a case study in that. So I think anyone interested in the economics of the program should definitely keep an eye out for that report.
Great.
Thank you, Chelsea, and thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate that, and fantastic, especially the detailed sort of action-orientated information that's really important if people are thinking about replicating something like this in their watershed. So thank you again for your time. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Danika Littlechild, our second keynote speaker this morning, to join us. Danika is a member of Ermineskin Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta, and she currently lives in the territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples in Ottawa. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University's Faculty of Public Affairs. Prior to joining Carleton, she was a practicing lawyer for 2 decades, serving Indigenous peoples, organizations, and institutions. Her work includes Indigenous legal orders, Indigenous governance, environmental law and water law, corporate and not-for-profit governance, and international law, all pertaining to Indigenous peoples. Danika served as an advisor to the Assembly of First Nations on water issues since 2007, and she continues to advise on water and environment-related matters. She's also a member of the Joint Committee on Climate Action, co-appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada and the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Her current research is on ethical spaces. And Danika's talk today focuses on engaging Indigenous systems in the context of water in Canada. GWF has partnered with Indigenous communities, governments, and organizations and funded 6 targeted co-created Indigenous projects. But even so, there's a need to amplify Indigenous voices around water, water governance, and water issues. As such, we're very pleased to have Danika with us to share her perspectives on the inclusion of Indigenous voices in Canada's water futures. Danika, the floor is yours.
Hi, Corinne. My gratitude to Global Water Futures for inviting me here to speak today. In my language, I give you thanks for that. I am from Neasqueag, from Ermineskin Cree Nation, and I'm a mom of a very active toddler who sounds like he's on his way to my office right now. I unfortunately do not have childcare at this time, so hopefully there are some folks out there who can empathize with pandemic parenting, and that's just the situation that we are all in currently. So I will thank you for any grace you can provide me in the context of my presentation today. I'm so pleased to be here to just have a chat about the different opportunities and challenges around sort of the engagement of Indigenous peoples in the context of water in Canada. And in particular, my focus today will be pretty much entirely on First Nations. And I want to start by saying that there are highly differentiated experiences that other Indigenous peoples besides First Nations, recognized First Nations that exist across the country and across borders. And so for the purposes of this presentation, I'll be focusing my contribution to my knowledge and experience and connectivity to First Nations in Canada. I want to also sort of provide a little bit of a caveat to this presentation. I don't have slides, and I'm not going to sort of enumerate data, statistics, talk in depth about technology or infrastructure, or even specific funding problems. And this may feel a little frustrating because, I know that there's a hunger for this information out there, but I also believe that this information is in fact findable. So if you have, which I'm sure you all do, a modicum of research skills, you can find this kind of data with some interested research. And so, so what I want to sort of tackle today are the much more unwieldy and topics that require some heavy lifting in terms of sort of walking us through and thinking a little more deeply about, I guess you could say, you know, the connections between peoples and history, the lands and waters in which we reside, and the work that we sort of do, and how we think about that work in the context of our relations or lack of relations to Indigenous peoples or Indigenous territories. I want to also begin by saying that I'm speaking to you not from my home of Neasqueyak in Treaty 6, but rather from the territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe in Ottawa, Ontario. And I think land acknowledgements are very important, and I'm really always very glad to see folks do land acknowledgements. I think part of what I hope to accomplish in my presentation today is to encourage you to move beyond acknowledgements towards real relationship and concepts of accountability, responsibility, and tangible sort of ways that you can represent the importance of those acknowledgements. So for example, for myself, in speaking to you from the territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples, what I have chosen to do beyond an acknowledgement is, in the course of my teaching, I privilege you know, the knowledge systems, the languages, and the protocols of the peoples in whose territories I am located in the way that I teach curriculum, and so that my students who are also learning in these territories understand, you know, as sort of a precursor to everything else that they're taught, you know, a much more deep connection and sort of takeaway that is going to hopefully contribute to the way that they relate to Indigenous peoples moving forward. In other words, finding ways of demonstrating beyond acknowledgements connections. And so this is very much what this presentation is about relationships. And so I think part of what is really important about that is to be able to sort of recognize the importance of understanding history in Canada and why it matters to think about colonization, its legacy, its ongoing impacts, thinking about having a critical eye to the legacy that this has, not only on Indigenous peoples, sort of as a topic or a subject, but also on the work that we do, which we consider to be neutral or out of the scope of colonialism. And so I'm speaking here to scenarios where, for example, someone might work in a lab and say, well, I am working in an entirely neutral environment that has nothing to do with sort of racialized experiences or colonization or oppression of Indigenous peoples. This is something that's an entirely neutral space that is addressing issues around, you know, data analysis or data collection. And to that, I would say that there is, in fact, you know, a very important foundation that underlies everything that sort of exists in Canada that is related to the usurpation of lands and waters, and you know, the displacement, criminalization, exclusion of Indigenous peoples, the estrangement of Indigenous peoples from water. This has regularly been happening and continues to happen. And I think sometimes these situations of estrangement, of separation, have been done, you know, with intent, with the intent of separating Indigenous peoples from lands and waters. Other times they are unintentional, maybe a function of the system which is being engaged with, maybe a function of just the natural behaviors that exist amongst people who are just doing their work and thinking of their job in a very neutral manner. So I want to sort of try to take us through a little bit of a journey today, if I'm able to talk about, you know, how we can perhaps demystify neutrality as opposed to sort of trying to demystify, for example, Indigenous knowledge, which the latter, which is far too ambitious for a 20-minute discussion. Here comes a toddler. Sorry about this. I'm doing my meeting, darling. Sorry about that. Okay. And so sorry about that, everyone. Just give me one moment.
Take as much time as you need, Danika. We all understand.
Sorry about that. Thanks so much. He's
No problem.
on his way to his grandmother's Coco. Yes. So trying to take us to a place where we can sort of turn a critical eye to our own situations. And so I think the other part of sort of, you know, what is challenging, I think, for Indigenous peoples when they're asked to speak to water issues, in particular to folks who really have no experience or knowledge around Indigenous peoples or Canadian history, perhaps, that it can feel kind of overwhelming to try to explain everything in a very short period of time. And so, so often you'll hear folks sort of go back to the far reaches of history and talking about initial settlement, etc. And the reason that always comes up is because it's a fundamental aspect and pillar on which Canada exists and continues to function. And it can feel challenging to go there because it's a far more ambiguous territory than the far safer paths of just thinking about how do we get safe drinking water to First Nations. You know, we can talk about treatment facilities, and we can talk about water operator training, and we can talk about, you know, appropriate funding, etc. But what I'm really getting at are the issues that have prevented good relations from existing, from being built in the first place, as well as sort of the ongoing gaps that feel very difficult to step over in partnership. And these are issues of environmental and social justice. You know, these are issues of, you know, a seeming inability to have things like treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements, which are also building blocks of Canada, from being effectively implemented. And so how do we sort of become good critical thinkers about building relationships? How do we become people who can inform ourselves and enter into relationship building with an element of respect with the people with whom we are engaging? you know, one of the challenges that many Indigenous peoples face is that a lot of times, you know, researchers and scientists kind of effectively come to the community empty-handed, so to speak. Not that they don't come with their technology and their science, but rather that they come with an entirely empty cup. They don't bother to do some preparatory work to get to a moment where they can demonstrate the kind of respect to say, I have an idea of who you might be. This is my understanding. Can you help me with that? And I think, you know, then it becomes like the onus shifts to Indigenous peoples to have to sort of enter into teaching moments, which take energy and take time, and which may not always be appropriate to the situation. And so one of the things that I encourage folks to do is to really, if this is an area that very much interests you, to do some of the work of preparing yourself to engage in this field, to find and seek out Indigenous scholarship and Indigenous voice on the issues facing Indigenous peoples in water in Canada. There are so many publications out there and wonderful articles written by amazing, you know, very well-informed people that are very much accessible to the public, but also very, very accessible to researchers. And I think, you know, part of the other challenge that Indigenous peoples often sort of face in trying to also collaborate and build good relationships is that, you know, they are trying to do that and function within a context of very significant constraints. These are legal constraints, they're policy constraints, they are infrastructure and funding constraints. And so attempting to engage with folks who you know, who are very who have great capacity, who may be very well funded, who have a lot of strength in terms of the legitimacy, perceived legitimacy of their organizations, etc. These are things that that are challenging for Indigenous peoples as well. And so so one of the final points that I'll make in this sort of context setting moment is that, you know, thinking about history and law, relationships, environmental and social justice, and decolonization, you know, which is really an understanding of the colonial legacy and ongoing impacts on Indigenous peoples, is kind of unfortunately, the path that we have to take to sort of counter the tendency of science and technology to universalize knowledge and ethics, and to sort of insist on their truth-telling power and privilege, as Kim Tallbear said in a presentation she made in 2019. And the effect of that tendency to universalize is in fact to marginalize Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. And so this is sort of, you know, the large elephant in the room, so to speak, that we sort of consistently face. You know, I've been in many meetings, for example, when I was a lawyer, working with First Nations, meeting with provincial governments or federal governments on water issues, and have, you know, their staff feel very frustrated with Indigenous leaders or First Nations leaders talking about history, talking about Indigenous laws around water, talking about Indigenous knowledge of water, talking about rights under the Constitution, jurisprudence, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I've seen so much frustration sort of build from our federal and provincial counterparts, you know, saying this is not the path we want to go on. This is a purely technical issue. We just want to get you guys some clean water. Why can't you just cooperate? You know, and that sort of combative conflict is very much premised, I think, in that tendency of thinking that there is a superior universal approach, and that what is great for the mainstream is also really great for Indigenous peoples. And maybe that is where the fundamental shift needs to happen. If we never get to the moment where we can think about Indigenous knowledge systems as being legitimate, as not being deficient, as not requiring the legitimacy of other scientific research to be real or factual, if we're unable to get to a moment where we can see Indigenous peoples not as subjects or topics, or even beneficiaries, but rather as true partners, where their systems can effectively function in parallel to other systems of knowledge like science, then I really fear that these big, you know, big hairy concepts of reconciliation, etc., would never really be realized, that they could never be implemented in a context where Indigenous systems continue to be subsumed by the dominant systems, by the ongoing legacy of colonialism, this concept that somehow indigeneity is an add-on or a special topic or something that is only relevant where we might need TK, TEK for the purposes of our study or our work. And I think, you know, going from a paradigm shift, from thinking about Indigenous knowledge as like either information or data to support scientific work, or that complements scientific work, or that even informs scientific work, to a moment where we can say, you know, that Indigenous systems begin to sincerely function with cohesion, you know, with integrity, then, you know, I really am worried about, you know, the possibilities around achieving true water justice for Indigenous peoples. I mean, we are in a situation right now where even the courts are unable to provide a good explanation as to why these very serious justice issues continue to face Indigenous peoples and their communities. You know, where even courts are unable to really understand why were reserves established where there was no water source. You know, why were communities established without any thought to infrastructure or connectivity? And furthermore, why were rights like hunting and fishing, you know, protected under the Canadian Constitution as ostensibly the highest law in the land, and yet, you know, these rights cannot be properly exercised because of, you know, lack of in-stream flow or contamination, toxicity, over-allocation, etc., right? Desertification, fundamental ecosystems changes that are happening, all because of the kinds of developments that have occurred without, you know, very much engagement or participation from Indigenous peoples. And so, you know, I think, you know, understanding how we can get to a moment where we can be able to articulate a critique of the system within which we are functioning. We have to be able to do that in order to make the appropriate space for the highly diverse and multiplicity of Indigenous knowledge systems that exist just within Canada alone and across the borders as well, right? And so, there is no sort of, unfortunately for a lot of folks, there's no one sort of approach that we can take to Indigenous knowledge. There is no one sort of template that's available for reconciliation, and there's no sort of easy way through this. And I think that's what is really making it difficult to deal with, because people really feel like and this is a natural human tendency, everybody does it, no matter who you are, a want to have something that is not going to be so challenging to navigate our way through. It's just the unfortunate fact that we have to slog through this together. and it may not be easy, but it's actually fairly simple, because what it requires us to do is, as I mentioned, to inform ourselves, to be critical thinkers, and to make the space for Indigenous peoples, for real Indigenous peoples, to talk to real Indigenous peoples, to engage with them in their territories, to understand that relationality. And that requires some work on the part of everybody, not just non-Indigenous folks, but also Indigenous folks, to also make that space for non-Indigenous peoples to come into their lives and to welcome that and to interact. And so, for Indigenous peoples, it's sort of trying to always fit ourselves into the dominant system has not really gotten us any measurable, tangible, positive, regressive results yet. We've tried the courts, we've tried negotiations, we've tried to participate in watershed organizations, we've published about things, we've tried to hold educational webinars, and all of these efforts, try to contribute to existing legal frameworks. A lot of folks are trying to contribute to the new water strategy, the new federal water strategy. A lot of Indigenous folks have tried to contribute to provincial, territorial regimes, but we still continue to see crises after crises existing all over the country. And I really think that until we sort of get to the crux of privilege and power, of meeting people where they actually are and understanding lived realities, we will not make the kind of progress that we wish to make. For Indigenous peoples, and I can only speak for the Cree at this moment, for us, water is a living entity that has autonomy. And this is not sort of like, parallel to the concept of legal personhood of water, which is quite different. That's predicated in the common law, or in other countries like New Zealand in the dominant legal system, for example. It is actually sort of, the idea is that we don't project our humanity onto water in terms of its autonomy, rather that we have sort of knowledge and beliefs that have developed over millennia related to how we understand our responsibilities to an entity that serves us, but that which we must also serve. And understanding water as this living force that is to be protected and nurtured, and in our own lives sort of grappling with our realities where we just have been so disconnected from having any agency, even within our own lives, never mind sort of in the environment around us. I mean, you know, so much of the decision making and you know, the concept of self-determination of a person, even as an individual, but also as a collective, you know, has really been quashed by a very unwieldy system of colonialism and oppression, right? And for so many of these years, for Indigenous peoples, we've really felt like the peoples who have been disposable, so to speak. So when you are, you know, think of the environment as having utility to humanity, of water as a commodity, and something to be utilized or even just measured, to put it in even more neutral terms, then there's sort of like this sense that we have of being excluded in our understandings of water, you know, in that context. So there's no parallels that we can draw to Indigenous perspectives around water when the imperative of the dominant system is so compelling and pervasive, that it is even in the hearts of very good people who do want to see Indigenous peoples be healthy. And Indigenous peoples, on the other hand, are thinking about water as this living source, as a giver of life, as the foundation of all of our rights and responsibilities. And our ability to even exercise lifeways is very much connected to being able to implement our Indigenous ways of living, ways of being, that have been so significantly disrupted. You know, I come from a place in sort of the southern part, middle, I guess central southern part of Alberta, where there has been just like complete development. Like there is no undeveloped place in the area where I live. You know, I grew up in a home where when I was, you know, 5 years old, my uncle would take me through the bush behind our house and explain all the biodiversity to me and give me teachings along the way. This is when you can harvest this fungus and this is what it's used for. You know, this is another medicine and this is what you can use it for, but this is, you know, what you have to think about when you pick it. And, you know, some of the language, aspects of our Cree language, aspects of our songs, our culture, our knowledge systems were taught to me in those walks. And now, you know, with my little one, if I take him back there, it's honestly just a cluster of birch trees and crabgrass. You know, there has been such a significant loss of biodiversity just within my own lifetime that I can't bring him to those places and teach him the same things anymore. And so, you know, so it's not just that I've been separated from decision making in terms of water management or sure honey, or water management, or you know, ensuring that we have healthy water to drink, but it's also about the viability of our knowledge systems and our language, and whether those things can continue, whether those stories can continue, whether this little guy will ever have a place to bring his children to teach them about our Niasqueak, our Cree connections to water, is really the issue at hand. And so for me, I really think that the time that we're being offered right now in the pandemic, I think is a bit of a gift in this regard. You know, I would encourage you all to sort of not be complacent about this time. If you have the hours, which you may not if you're parenting the pandemic, but if you do have the time, start to research, start to inform yourself, to prepare yourself for building relationships, and to start to understand some of the histories and the constraints facing Indigenous peoples in the context of water. And I really hope that all of you continue to walk in safety wherever you might be in this tumultuous period, but also to remember that, you know, for us as Indigenous peoples, it's such a multiplicity of levels of constraints and challenges when it comes to water, that there's no sort of single problem that can be solved in a silo, that we have to understand it from multiple ways of knowing to maybe get to a good solution. So I thank all of you for your patience with my little guy today, and I wish you all well, and hope that if there's any questions that I'm able to answer them. And the presentation might have been a bit wobbly just because I wasn't expecting him to be here. So I've been doing my best, but thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Danika. And all I can say is that your perseverance and your ability to juggle multiple roles and responsibilities came through. And it was a pleasure to hear you and to listen to what you had to say. You've really reminded us that the truth and the history is an important part of the truth and reconciliation process that we cannot forget and that we must not forget. And articulating how important relationships are, and the fact that all of us must engage in those relationships as part of positive action towards reconciliation and the braiding or bonding of traditional and Western knowledge systems. I will be opening up the Q&A now, so don't forget, audience, to put your questions in the Q&A box or to vote for questions that you would like to see answered. And Danika, I'll just give you a heads up. There have been several questions. You threw down the gauntlet earlier when you said that you had an audience of researchers who could go out and find more, and you've really inspired people to look for more information. And so there are a lot of people asking where they should start. So if at the end you could give people perhaps a couple of key articles or authors that they could start their research journey on, that would be fantastic. And in the meantime, I'm just going to hand over to Stephanie because she's in control of the questions, not so much the answers.
Oh gosh, no. Thanks so much. I also want to recognize your amazing ability to be multitasking. Everybody is very envious of your focus. One of the most popular questions that came in was about really understanding the differences between Western society and Indigenous peoples' worldviews, and specifically around water and water management. And I think you actually really talked about this and really did a good job, but I just wanted to recognize that you know, has been voted to the top of the list and during the entire session, and offer you to continue or to expand on that if you like. And a related question, maybe you could talk a little bit about how Indigenous peoples view climate changes and observe climate changes, and how that is woven into decision making at the community level.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges that I tried to sort of articulate, and may not have done a great job given my circumstances, but you know, was sort of the dissonance between approaches under sort of mainstream systems, if you want to call it that, and approaches of Indigenous peoples, tempered by the fact that I also don't want to romanticize Indigenous approaches either. That's not my intent today, right? So that's why I talked about lived realities and tangible, real, progressive work that we can do to address what's actually happening. There are important aspects of how Indigenous people sort of understand water that are being implemented from Indigenous knowledge systems, from Indigenous systems. from Indigenous epistemologies or worldview, as they may also be called or known. But I think also that that it's really important to recognize that it's very difficult to navigate an encounter between these knowledge systems that is in fact ethical. And so a huge part of the work that I do right now as a researcher myself is about trying to articulate an ethical space of engagement between Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge systems. So if you guys Google me and look up my Carleton profile, my faculty page, there are a few publications there now. I've just become a scholar in 2020, so I don't have much there. I have only a couple co-authored articles, but I'm research lead on ethical space for a really amazing project called Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. And if you look up the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, you'll find the ethical space page, which will give you some resources and give you, oh, don't draw on the laptop, honey. Give you a little bit of a primer on the kind of approach that I recommend in taking to understanding appropriate ethical encounters between and amongst knowledge systems, plural. And so I would really encourage you to check those out. There are some YouTube videos. I did a webinar with Reconciling Our Ways of Knowing, which is a really amazing collaborative project led by the David Suzuki Foundation, amongst others, which also talked about ethical space, engaging with some elder and knowledge keepers in that webinar. And so I think, you know, for me, it's really not so much about sort of demystifying and saying, like, what is Indigenous knowledge? I always equate that to sort of going up to a scientist and saying, so what is scientific knowledge? Can you tell me in the next like 20 minutes and explain it all to me? I really want to understand it. And, you know, anybody would be hard put to sort of do that in the context of a 20-minute answer or presentation, or even a 5-minute answer. Similarly for Indigenous systems, they are so massive, complex, connected to place and space, and are held, the knowledge is held by different people, just as scientific knowledge is not all held by one person, like all scientific knowledge in the world, right? So all Indigenous knowledge within one Indigenous system is not held by one person. There are different people who hold different parts of knowledge. And so knowing how to collaboratively co-create an ethical space of engagement is really an exciting thing for me. And so I would love to continue to chat with you about that, but I don't want to take too much time in the Q&A, but just to point you to those resources and to encourage you to think about how to ethically engage in your own work. Like, what would ethical engagement really look like for you? What are some of the standards with which you have to sort of conduct yourself as a scientist, but maybe also in terms of, you know, how you conduct yourself in relation to Indigenous peoples? There may be standards that you're not familiar with yet. Like, it's not just the UN Declaration or the Canadian Constitution. There may be other existing or emerging standards that are meaningful and impactful for the work that you do. And so part of that is also sort of understanding the landscape, so to speak, within which you're working. So I hope that that's a good answer to the initial question, sort of about worldviews and knowledge systems.
Yes, absolutely. And we did have a question about the ethical space. So it's great that you've mentioned that and provided some more further reading for the individuals who were asking those questions. A question about, you know, whether you can speak to what are the kind of largest barriers within the Canadian government framework that stops from water management from being more inclusive of Indigenous governance? And then are there any case studies or any advances in policy development in Canadian law that we can learn good lessons from?
Well, I don't have so much good news, But, you know, I think what's most encouraging to me is that people are excited about reconciliation, and what it means is that people are starting to explore what reconciliation might mean to them and their organization, which may also, sometimes I'm a climbing frame, which may also sort of, mommy has to talk, okay? Do you want to go to the beach? Okay, you gotta let mommy talk, okay? We're going swimming in the river, so this is the motivation.
And we're going to dry up?
Yes, we'll dry up on the sand. Yeah.
No, on the pool.
Okay. Yeah, this little guy loves swimming in the river. We went yesterday. So I was talking about, can you remind me quickly?
Say,
Sorry, guys, I don't think I can answer it, but please email me your questions and I will answer them more comprehensively than I'm able to right now. Being assaulted by a toddler, sorry.
That's more than fine. We're just about out of time anyway, and so it's a good time to wrap up. And how much more appropriate can you get than to go swimming after a water talk? So absolutely. And I just want to thank both of you again for what you've done and the insight that you've brought onto different but related topics in terms of engagement of people, engagement of communities, engagement of Indigenous ways of knowing. And so I'd like to thank both of you, Chelsea and Danika, for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge and experiences, creating such an engaging environment for our discussions. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, as well. Virtual formats, we're all getting used to it, but we really appreciate you attending and participating in the discussion. It's your questions that have really added to the depth of the conversation that we've been able to have this morning. And so we're excited to have you join us. Of course, don't forget, this is only the start of day 2. We have many more sessions to come, and here are some program highlights for the rest of today. And I will flag to you, for those of you who are interested, there is a stream on the Indigenous engagement and the co-created projects and programs. It's being co-chaired by Dawn Martin-Hill and Lawrence Martz. If you missed yesterday's on Indigenous engagement, then you can watch it on the video. And today we're talking about Indigenous governance and within the research and research projects and water. And so again, feel free to participate in those sessions. And so I will say thank you and see you again soon.